And people see executive producer Ridley Scott on the poster, Joe Public. You know, they'll often wonder, well, what does that mean in practical terms? We know that he's there so that you can attract talent like McAvoy and Strong, I'm presuming, but on a practical level and conversations that you had with him, tell me about that.
People get confused with what an executive producer is or a producer, and and some people say, do you ever worry that having Ridley Scott's name on the front of the poster, they believe that it was directed by Ridley Scott? And I'm like, look, I was a guy that made $100,000 movie and we shot it in 18 days. And even though I've been nominated for BAFTA, there was only a certain amount of traction that I could have in order to get Welcome to the Punch off the ground. So we needed an executive producer that could help us get it moving forward. And so we sent the script to Scott Free. They sent it over to him in LA. He loved my first film, Shifty. He responded to Welcome to the Punch. I went over, met him, and then he came on board as an executive producer, and his role is picking up the phone to actors. His name lends a certain cachet to the project because if people like Mark Strong or James McAvoy see Ridley Scott's names on, attached to the production, it's going to give them a level of feeling comfortable that that Ridley Scott's on the end of the phone if we have any problems, or to talk to, or being a mentor to myself. And then he was instrumental in the script development process of kind of sitting down like me and you are now in a room every week whilst in pre-production and talking about the screenplay. And then when we shot the film, he went off and shot Prometheus, so he wasn't very much involved in the shooting of the movie. He would watch rushes every night. I know that he watched rushes every night and was very pleased with what he was seeing. And then he became very instrumental in the editing process and the cutting of the film. And that's where you sort of saw the experience of Ridley Scott come into play, because we're cutting the film together. It's too baggy, it's too long, it's not quite working out, and he can kind of just comes in with these amazing little notes, say cut this, cut that, bang bang. If you take this here, you move that shot to there. It sounds very simple, and it kind of and he pieces it together and he helps you kind of fine tune the movie, and that's where we sort of really saw his experience come into play, and with music and kind of talking about that, the score come into play.
And every review, mine included, has talked about the Nan's house shootout scene, which is fantastic, and it's also quite ludicrous and very, very stylized.
Yeah.
It feels somewhat quite different in tone than a lot of the rest of the film, and I'm wondering if in maybe early drafts of the script, that Tarantino-esque flavour was more evident. You talked about streamlining, and I'm wondering if that's part of that.
I think as you make a film, I'm a second-time filmmaker, and you make a movie like Welcome to the Punch, and you're just learning your craft as you go along. I think it was always very intentional that the rest of the film is draped in this sort of neon noir city, nighttime, kind of a very Hong Kong feel to the vibe. And then we were always very aware that suddenly the movie moves into this old woman's house, and you've not seen, within the film there's no patterns on carpets or curtains, or it's all very streamlined. It's steel, glass, chrome, brushed concrete, marble, and suddenly you move into this old woman's house, and it's kind of china dolls on the shelves, and paisley wallpaper, and kind of deep rug carpet, and that was very intentional. And the sequence was going to be a much bigger action sequence where Johnny Harris escaped out the door, and they went and chased him down the road. And we decided to contain it within this space. And I think it was always meant as a slight relief to the audience, because the film has been like a pressure bubble up until that point, and it kind of, there's an explosion of kind of laughter and stuff when Johnny Harris walks into the house. And you are kind of fine line, because you almost don't want to pull people out of the film, do you know what I mean? Because it almost stands out in this kind of very Tarantino-esque way. I think what I learned a little bit is that I wish I'd put a similar scene like that at the beginning of the film. Something that balanced it a little bit better, do you know what I mean? So you sort of felt that sometimes what you learn, as a filmmaker, you need to learn with every project you do and look back and say, well, what can I learn from there? And I think the intensity of which we made that film, we were so intent on getting it made after Shifty, that we were just like, we need to make this film, it's got to be made. There's no possibility this film never gets made, because we need to move forward with our careers, and we were also ambitious. And some of that intensity bled through into the film, just like how the characters all kind of going at each other. It's very intense. And then there's that explosion of comedy, when the Nan scene happens. And I sometimes wished I'd brought a little bit of comedy more into the front of the film as well, and peppered it up and had a little bit more light and shade. But that's just the experience you earn from maybe being a filmmaker. But it was always very much intended that it was going to make you sit up in the cinema and take notes of that scene. And it is one of the scenes that loads of people, like we did a Q&A and a screening yesterday at Leicester Square, and everyone was going mad about it in the audience. And there was one guy who was just like, "I just love that scene, man! I love that scene." I feel I'm going to be asking questions about that scene for a long time to come.
Probably the next film as well.
Yeah, the next one, yeah, with Johnny Harris will as well.
Now, it's quite front-loaded with action, but people who've not seen it yet, who are going to go over the weekend, that they should know also that it's quite plot-heavy, and that's a good thing. It's got quite a strong kind of 70s vibe. Yeah. You know, I was thinking of Parallax View and things like that. As a writer, can you tell me about maybe a scene or a development within that conspiracy plot, something that just kept you up at nights, that you had to really work on to nail it?
I think the tough thing is that it's easier to write the sequences like in the Nan's house, like that Nan sequence and that whole sequence in the Nan's house and that result in the shootout. I wrote in one sitting, you know, I wrote it in a few hours, and it never really ever changed. And I think those sort of political scenes, they change consistently because you're never quite making them work. It's not a world which I live in, and I don't often run into politicians, do you know what I mean, or people in power in the police force. So what we had to do was go and visit politicians and talk to people like a political advisor. I chatted to police officers. I did a lot of research about the police force and how they operate, because even though I was kind of making an almost Gotham-esque universe, you kind of have to play by the rules of how politicians and police actually operate. And I think that was the tough stuff, was just trying to make that work and what the conspiracy was. And I spent a lot of time doing research and figuring out how that would play out. And I was saying that we asked a political advisor, and he said that actual conspiracy that we came up with, he would be surprised if it hadn't actually happened. Not exactly in the way we played out, but that someone in the shadow cabinet hadn't somehow coerced somebody to do something in order to get some swing votes close to an election. Do you know what I mean? So I was just reflecting on what was going on around me at the time.
And finally, let's talk about your fantastic cast.
Yeah.
And again, coming from something like Shifty to this, just the excitement of directing people like Mark Strong and James McAvoy in the leads. Just talk about working with them.
I think something you learn as a director, and when I first started directing music videos and commercials, you'd go on set and you'd have a loud hailer wearing jodhpurs and thinking you needed to be an old school director and going, "You boy, you over there, you do this," and shouting out directions. But then the more you direct and the more you learn, the more you realise is that the best way of directing, that I feel for myself, is that if you hire someone like James McAvoy, Mark Strong, Andrew Riseborough, is to you hire them because they're good at their job, and so they're going to come in with a lot of ideas of how they're going to do it, and you need to give them the freedom and the space in order to do that. And I think what I learned with working with people like James, Peter Mullen, who's a director in his own right, and Andrew Riseborough, Mark Strong, James McAvoy, Danny Mays, David Morrissey, Johnny Harris, is that to give an actor too many notes can kind of affect their performance. Because sometimes you feel, because I'm the director, I feel like in between takes I must be going up and speaking to them because other directors must do that. And I feel that the best way to do it is to watch their performance, go up to them afterwards, and this is what I learned with working with actors like James McAvoy and Andrew Riseborough, who've got, they've got great opinions, they're smart people, and you say to them, how did that feel to you? How did that performance, that last take, feel to you? And they'll say, well, I kind of, at the beginning was a bit dodgy, but I felt like the end was right. And I'm like, yeah, exactly, I felt exactly the same sort of thing, that the beginning wasn't quite working out. And I said, what do you reckon we should do to make that work? And he said, well, what about if I try this? I'm like, well, yeah, but make sure you do this, and we'll get there together. Rather than as before, I would go in with 100 different directions, and then the scene would go off in some tangent, and I think, how did it end up there? But it was usually my fault because I was thinking I had to say too much. And I think sometimes as a director, you can just sit back and gently manipulate it to the place that you want to be, but not feel like that you should have to kind of be barking and shouting orders to actors the whole time, and listen to what they've got to say. And I think that's what I learned on Welcome to the Punch very much so, is like listening to the actors and taking on board what they say.
So having those strong opinions, and you've lived with the script for a long time, back to front, sideways.
Yeah. Can
you give us just one moment where you were watching them do something and it just totally flipped the script on what you thought the scene was about? It gave you something fresh and... Yeah,
for example, there's a couple of sequences. There's the sequence where James McAvoy and Andrew Riseborough are at the hospital, and they're talking about him being stuck in the past and what happened to him. And originally, they were there and they were going to kiss, and they were going to sort of move in to kiss, and I can't remember exactly how it played out in the script. I think it was close to kissing, and then they both just backed away. And then James, being a selfless actor, said I should move to kiss her, I should go for it. And she basically just pushes me away, because it sort of shows how confused I'm in my head. I'm reading the wrong messages from her. I'm kind of trying to show up this confident front, but actually inside I'm crumbling away. And he said, and I was like, you sure? He's like, no, I want it to be that on screen. I want to actually actively go in to kiss her. And she sort of backs off and is like, do you know what I mean? So she pushes him away and rebuffs his advances. And that's kind of great, and people love that little moment in the film where James goes to do the kiss and she backs away from him, and that's just a little moment that comes up, for example, where it's just the blocking of the scene, how the actors move. And then another example is on the sequence in the Thames River where James McAvoy and Mark Strong, and they've both just experienced the two deaths in the film, and they're both kind of in a catatonic state about it. And originally it was a massive, big argument between the two of them, and they were raging at each other, and we rehearsed this huge sequence where they're shouting and screaming, and it felt like an episode of EastEnders. We never seemed to make it work. My mother had almost died a year before of liver failure, and when she went up for the operation, I couldn't speak. I was like, after the operation, I was like catatonic. I could hardly speak. I couldn't find the words I needed to express what I wanted to say to my father and the people around me. So I said to Mark Strong and James McAvoy, I don't think they'd have this big argument after what they've just been through. I think that they wouldn't be able to find the words, and it'd be very minimal and to the point, exactly what they need to say. So when Mark Strong goes up to him and he just says, who killed my son? And he's like, he turns around to me and he just says the thing that's on his mind, why didn't you shoot me in that tunnel? And you know, the things that they need to say are just said. And then James McAvoy goes off and he cries, and you see him sort of coming to terms with him having to put the past behind him and team up with his nemesis to a degree. And that all came on the day. You know, we figured that stuff out on the day, and what was scripted, and we totally went off and rewrote it and stripped away all the dialogue. And that's the beauty of it, like filmmaking. Sometimes you can get lucky, sometimes you don't. And hopefully we managed to make that work.
Well, I think that's what we'll say to our viewers, is that, you know, as great as the action is, you've got great actors as well. Yeah. And that would be certainly the reason to get a ticket when it opens this weekend. Ron, thanks so much for talking to Cine Outsider, and we wish you all the best with the film. Well, we'd say we wish, but we know it's going to be a big success.
Thank you very much.
If the number of buses are anything to go by, we've got a winner.
Yeah, we've got a winner. Thank you very much.